So who is Māra in Buddhism? Today I'm going to talk about who Māra is and give an example of a simile of Māra and the island that I think goes a long way towards explaining Māra's role within Buddhist thought. Coming right up. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled life, consider subscribing. So who is Māra in Buddhism? Māra is a personification of temptation, of our desire to grasp at things, to cling to things, to want things. So Māra is known as the tempter. And in that sense, Māra is similar in certain ways and different in other ways to the devil within the Western, let's say, Christian tradition, where the devil is also a tempter. The difference is that the devil is, first of all, very much supposed to be a real person for some, although Māra also is for some Buddhists. The devil is supposed to be someone who draws us away from God, who in other words, who tempts us away from God's will. Māra, on the other hand, doesn't tempt us away from anyone's will. Māra is simply a personification of temptation itself, of temptation generally. That is, Māra is sort of a personification of craving and of self-identification generally. So we have a tendency to crave things, we have a tendency to identify ourselves with things. And this isn't always evil. This is one thing to be very clear on. Whereas the devil is usually, in the Western tradition, understood as someone who's the personification of evil, who tries to get us to do evil things, bad things. Māra isn't always that way. I mean, of course, Māra does try to get us to do evil things too, but not always. As I say, sometimes craving isn't evil, it's just craving. Sometimes self-identification isn't evil, it's just self-identification. And we'll get into that. So we can clearly crave bad things. Sometimes we crave to kill somebody. That's an example of hatred. We can crave to steal something. That's an example of greed. We can crave to lie to people. That's an example of fomenting, promoting ignorance. And these are things, obviously, that are wrong within the Buddhist tradition. They're wrong. They're not ethical things to do. But we can also crave things that are apparently good. We can crave a healthy family. We can crave a long life. We can crave a heavenly reward for some of us. That's something we crave. We can crave a good government. We can crave a good socio-political atmosphere. And there's nothing wrong with these. In fact, in some ways, they're morally good, but they're things that nevertheless we can crave. And so to that extent, Māra is right there. If you take it from a Buddhist understanding, the personification of these things would be Māra. So when we engage in this kind of craving and self-identification, identifying ourselves with certain aspects of the world and in contrary to other aspects, when we do that, we make ourselves open to Māra. And it's said that Māra sees us and that Māra can control us at that point. That is to say, we're seen by craving. Again, understanding craving in a kind of a personalized sense and under the control of craving. So within the Western tradition, the devil, of course, we know, condemns us to an eternity of hellfire. That's the sort of traditional understanding of the devil's role. Māra, on the other hand, condemns us to dukkha, to suffering in this very life, condemns us to the kind of things that the feeling of life not being satisfactory. That's sort of Māra's condemnation. It's not eternal. It has its end. It's not hellfire per se, although it can become that depending on how bad it gets. But it simply is this sense of suffering that we have as an emotional kind of attachment to other things. And this suffering can arise even if we're craving or identifying ourselves with things that are good, with things that are wholesome. For example, a good family life. If we identify ourselves with that or crave that, then if somebody gets sick or if we get divorced, all of a sudden we are in deep suffering. If we crave a long life, well, of course, if we get sick, if we get very deeply sick, we can suffer mentally because of that. In addition to the sickness itself, we can have mental suffering because we felt attached to the notion of a long life. So, we can We can suffer if politics don't go our way. We may wish for social justice, but when social justice isn't forthcoming, when social justice takes longer than we might anticipate or hope, we can suffer for that, which is, again, over and above the suffering that comes just in the injustice. There's an additional emotional suffering that comes if we are attached to it or if we crave it. So that's the difficulty that we're in. But what's the solution? And here I would suggest that we think of what the Buddha said near the end of his life in the sutta that was written at that time, the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, where he talks about making yourself an island, making the Dhamma an island, making yourself a refuge, and making the Dhamma a refuge. And these are, of course, the ways that we make our practice and our understanding, our wisdom, a kind of refuge for us. But what does this really mean? And here the Buddha gives a really interesting simile in one of the earliest texts in the Buddhist tradition, which is known as the Parayana-vagga. The Parayana-vagga is a group of questions and answers that the Buddha was given. He's given the questions by a number of different Brahmins, and he gives answers to them that are, many of them, quite profound. And this has become part of what's called the Sutta Nipata, which is a book of relatively early texts. Some of them are relatively early, and these are some of the earliest. They seem to be from a time in the Buddha's life, perhaps, when the Dhamma as a whole wasn't completely constructed, so he was sort of thinking things through, which isn't to say that there's any confusion here. He was quite definite about what he was saying, but we don't find the more fully described aspects of Dhamma, which makes some of us believe that it was relatively early. So in that text, the Buddha asks us to consider life as like a stream, and consider the tribulations of life, especially when they get difficult, when we're in mental suffering or mental anguish, to be like a stream that's in flood. And we're trying to cross this stream, but the stream is rising around us. We're in flood conditions, and so we're perhaps gripped with fear and suffering and a sense of a potential loss. So I think it's a wonderful simile for the kind of mental states that we get into when we're suffering. And so the Buddha says, "For those standing in the midst of the stream, when a perilous flood has arisen, for those oppressed by old age and death, let me declare an island to you." So in the Parayana-vagga, the Buddha is often responding to questions about death, or trying to frame his answers in terms of suffering and death, which of course are the great heart of much of what makes suffering so difficult. Here we have a flood of mental proliferation around our emotional states, thinking about the future, thinking about the past, the mind sort of whirling around. And that's an example, again, of this mind in flood when it's attacked by the possibility of death, which again is only one example, but it's a particularly pertinent example to consider here. So the Buddha goes on, "Let me declare an island to you. Owning nothing, taking nothing, this is the island with nothing further. I call this Nibbana, the extinction of old age and death. Having understood this, those mindful ones are quenched in this very life. They do not come under Māra's control, nor are they Māra's footmen." Now, of course, in a traditional understanding, the extinction of old age and death is because once we reach the state of awakening, we're no longer within the round of rebirths, and so we're not reborn into a future life. Within a more secular context, the extinction of old age and death is more simply the extinction of our mental attachment towards life, mental attachment towards youth. And so as that attachment subsides, then we're more able to accept them for what they are. And so, in a sense, we're no longer perturbed by old age and death, and in a sense, they're extinguished. So, but the Buddha says owning nothing and taking nothing. And that's sort of the key here. Owning nothing, that is, we've relinquished everything. We have no use for the things that we had before, at least in an emotional sense. It doesn't mean literally relinquishing everything, although we could if we wanted to, let's say, become a monastic. But even if we don't become a monastic, even if we're in a householder kind of situation, owning nothing simply means a mental state, a state of emotional detachment in a wholesome sense from the objects and even the people around us. which doesn't mean that we don't have metta, loving kindness for them. It simply means that we're not identified with them. We have no sense that they are mine, that they're owned by us in any kind of a way, that we control them in any way. And so them being their own thing, being out of our control, we're more able to accept the vicissitudes of life that come with the loss of personal possessions, with the loss of relationships, with the loss of people as they pass on. So that's the first. The second is taking nothing. That is to say, wanting nothing. Or another way to put that is to be without greed, to be without any kind of strong emotional desire for the world to be a certain way, in particular a certain way that it isn't, or even a particular way that it is that we don't want to end. So if we're taking nothing, we're basically in a state of equanimity with the world. And such people as this, with true equanimity, are people that Māra cannot control. Or in other suttas, which I'll also link down below, the Buddha also describes this as Māra not being able to see them. That is to say, Māra is kind of, in early Buddhism, understood to be this, again, this personification of attachment and greed. And so Māra is sort of thought of as somebody looking around in the world, trying to see people that he can tempt. If we are without greed, if we are completely equanimous with the world, if we're completely in a state of non-attachment to the world, then we're in a place where Māra can't see us. That's at least the metaphor, the simile that's given, that we're sort of, Māra sort of blind to us. So these metaphors of Māra as a personification of temptation, greed, attachment, and the island as a place of refuge and of safety, the practice, the path that leads us to this island of safety, which is an island of equanimity, of non-attachment, of non-emotional interaction with the world, in a way that makes us suffer. These are powerful metaphors, I think, from the earliest stratum of Buddhism and into early Buddhism in general, that may be helpful to us, to some of us along the path. Now, of course, I don't hesitate to say that there are many people for whom these metaphors won't be useful. Many secular people don't like the idea of personifying anything that's even smells of evil or smells of the devil, because of course within the Western tradition the metaphor of the devil has been used to foment a lot of ills in the world. And so for some people the metaphor of Māra just will be too close to that, and so they won't be really interested in using such a metaphor. But I think it depends, and I think it's something that we should at least consider to have in our kit bag, if you like, as we practice going forward. So I hope that's been useful to you. I'd be interested to hear what you think. Is this kind of metaphor useful to you or not? It certainly is one that one finds a lot in the early texts if you look around for it. And if you're interested in further discussions of these kinds of things, stuff on the web that I find, and if you're interested in supporting the channel, check out my Patreon page. I've got it linked down below. Thanks so much to all of you. Thanks so much to my Patreon supporters. It's great to have your support. Thanks so much to everybody who comments on these videos. It's always wonderful reading comments of all kinds, and I'm sure other people enjoy reading them too. So thanks again, and we'll catch you on the next one of these videos. Meanwhile, be well.